The desk was a graveyard of cold coffee cups and stale evidence reports. Detective Elias Thorne, 38, felt the weight of every unsolved case pressed down on the cracked leather of his chair. Thorne wasn't the kind of cop who sought the limelight, he sought the silence that followed justice. But the silence in Black Creek had been broken 6 months ago, not by a bang, but by an unsettling, almost imperceptible hum.it began with the disappearance of Sarah Jenkins, a local librarian whose most rebellious act was forgetting to return a book. No forced entry. No ransom note. No witnesses. Just a perfectly set dinner table for one, and an open book lying face down on the couch. Thorne was initially assigned the missing persons report, a routine file destined for the dust heap of cold cases. But then, the anomalies began. First, it was the salt. Thorne had returned to Sarah's house, a small, 2-bedroom bungalow nestled in the woods, on a hunch. The forensics team had missed nothing, but Thorne's gut often saw what the mass spec couldn't. He found it in the crawl space beneath the house, the entrance hidden behind a stack of old vinyl records. There, scattered in a near-perfect circle, was a thick, pristine white line of rock salt. Not spilled, placed. It was too precise for a spill. He mentioned it to his partner, Officer Maya Singh, a sharp, young officer with a master's in criminology and a healthy skepticism for anything that smelled like woo-woo. Ritualistic protection, Detective? Singh said, tapping a pencil against the plastic evidence bag. Against slugs? Or something else, Thorne muttered, staring at the grainy photo of the salt circle. It wasn't fresh, Maya. It looked old. Like it had been there for years, but undisturbed. And Sarah was an atheist, by the way. No history of occult interest. The case was officially reclassified from missing person to unusual circumstances. Then, the second anomaly surfaced a week later, with the discovery of Sarah's car. It was found parked legally in the long-term lot of the abandoned Black Creek Amusement Park, 3 towns over. The park had been closed for 20 years after a fatal roller coaster derailment. The car was locked. The key was in the ignition, and on the passenger seat, resting on a neatly folded town map, was a single item that made Thorne's blood run cold. It wasn't a clue, or a note, or a piece of jewelry. It was a perfectly carved wooden whistle. It was pitch black, smooth, and had no mouthpiece, just a small, asymmetrical hole drilled into the side. It was clearly designed not to be blown, but to whistle on its own. "This is getting weird, Elias," Singh said, her usual composure cracking. "Why abandon a car with the keys in, only to place a kid's toy inside?" Thorne picked up the whistle, the wood strangely warm to the touch. He turned it over in his hand, feeling the subtle vibration of the surrounding air against the smooth surface. He heard nothing, but he felt a distinct, prickling sensation on his neck, like being watched through a one-way mirror. "It's not a toy, Maya," Thorne said, slipping the strange artifact into an evidence bag. "It's a lure." The next night, Thorne was alone, reviewing the park's decades-old blueprints, trying to find a security office or an overlooked entrance. The police station was quiet, save for the rhythmic click-clack of the ancient air conditioning unit. Then, the click-clack stopped, and from the evidence locker, sealed tight behind reinforced steel and a keypad lock, Thorne heard it. A sound that shouldn't exist. A faint, but undeniable, sound of a single, slow, perfect note being played. It was the whistle. Thorne bolted upright, his hand instinctively going to the Glock holstered beneath his desk. He stared at the security monitor for the evidence room. The camera feed showed nothing. The room was dark, silent, and sealed. He knew what the sound meant. It wasn't the air, or the pipes, or a trick of the mind. The lure had worked, and something had just answered. The silence that followed the whistle was worse than the sound itself. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed the air out of the room. Detective Thorne's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was a man of facts, of probable cause and verifiable evidence, yet the only sound he could verify was one that defied physics, a whistle playing inside a sealed metal box. Thorne moved. He didn't call for backup, he knew how this sounded. He grabbed his tactical flashlight, the beam cutting a thick, pale cylinder through the stagnant office air, and sprinted down the deserted corridor toward the evidence locker. The evidence room was secured by a heavy steel door, keycard access, and a 6-digit numerical code. It was virtually soundproof. Thorne punched in the code, 7-3-4-2-0-0, the numbers clicking like broken teeth in the quiet. The pneumatic hiss of the door opening felt impossibly loud. He stepped across the threshold, gun drawn, the flashlight sweeping rapidly over the aisles of numbered shelves. The air inside was several degrees colder than the hallway, smelling faintly of dry paper and ozone. Evidence shelf 4B, where case 734's artifacts were stored, was against the back wall. Thorne's light pinned the clear plastic bin labeled Jenkins, S missing. The bin was intact. The wooden whistle, now bagged and tagged as 734-14, lay exactly where he'd placed it, on a layer of protective foam. It was not moving. It was not vibrating. It was completely silent. Thorne slowly lowered his weapon, exhaling a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was the AC. The old pipes. Fatigue. Anything but that. He took a step closer, shining the light directly onto the evidence bag. The clear plastic surface caught the light, reflecting a faint, distorted image of Thorne's own tired face. Then, he saw it. Not an auditory anomaly, but a visual one. The plastic evidence bag containing the whistle was no longer perfectly sealed. The Ziploc closure, which Thorne distinctly remembered securing, had been unzipped by perhaps half an inch. And clinging to the inside of the clear plastic, directly above the opening, was a single, fine strand of dark hair. It was too long to be his, too dark to be Sarah Jenkins. It looked wet. Thorne swallowed, fighting the sudden urge to back away. He reached for the bag, careful to only touch the outside, and angled it toward the light, and that's when the sound returned. It wasn't the whistle this time. It was a sound that made the air feel suddenly thick and heavy, like trying to breathe underwater. It was a low, resonant hum, the same unsettling, imperceptible noise he'd felt pressuring the town for the last 6 months. It vibrated up through the concrete floor, through the soles of his boots, and into his bones. The fluorescent lights lining the ceiling of the evidence room began to flicker erratically, buzzing loud enough to drown out the distant drone of the city. Thorne pulled out his phone and hit the record button on his camera, aiming it at the evidence shelf. Verification. Documentation. As he did, the temperature in the room plummeted further. He could see his breath clouding in the flashlight beam. A thin, crystalline layer of frost began to spiderweb across the surface of the plastic bin next to case 734, specifically the one labeled, Unidentified Remains. The hair-thin strand inside the whistle's bag began to twitch, and then, a voice, not an echo, not a whisper, but a clear, chilling contralto that seemed to emanate not from the air, but from inside his skull, spoke a single, terrifying word. Found. Thorne didn't hesitate. He knew the protocol for unauthorized access: secure the area, report to a superior, wait for forensics. But this was beyond protocol. He slammed the evidence room door shut and, instead of securing the lock, he jammed a heavy metal wedge beneath the hydraulic closure. He was trapping it inside. As he turned to run back toward his desk and call the chief, the intercom in the hallway crackled violently, overriding the police frequency. A woman's voice, not the chilling contralto from his head, but a standard, automated voice like a security message, cut through the noise. Attention all personnel. An internal containment breach has been detected. All exits are now locked. Please remain calm. Containment is now in effect. The station was locked down. Thorne was alone, trapped inside with whatever had just answered the whistle's call. He looked back at the sealed evidence room door, the heavy steel trembling slightly against the wedge. The hunt had begun, but Thorne wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the bait. Panic was a luxury Thorne couldn't afford. The station lockdown meant no one was getting in, and more importantly, no one was getting out. He sprinted back to his desk, the fluorescent light still flickering intermittently, casting grotesque, elongated shadows that danced like phantoms in the periphery of his vision. His comms radio sat silently on its charging dock. He snatched it up, thumbing the activation button. Nothing. He tried again. Still silence, just a faint, irritating static hiss that seemed to mock him. The police band, usually a cacophony of chatter, was completely dead. He grabbed his desk phone, punching in Chief Anderson's direct line. The line rang once, twice, then a click, and the same static hiss filled his ear. No dial tone. No voice. Just the white noise of a broken connection. He tried 911. Same result. The internal communication system was down. The external one, too. Hello? Anyone? Thorne barked into his dead radio, desperation gnawing at the edges of his comm. The static answered him. But this time, it wasn't just white noise. Within the hiss, a faint, almost subliminal pattern began to emerge. It sounded like whispers, layered and distorted, just beneath the threshold of intelligibility. He strained to hear, tilting his head. Found, found, found. The whispers were repeating the same word he'd heard in his head. Thorne slammed the radio back onto his desk. Whatever was in the evidence room wasn't just physical, it was capable of disrupting frequencies, of hijacking his thoughts, of listening. He needed to find a way out. Every exit was locked. He remembered the old emergency override panel in the chief's office, a manual release for the main doors in case of a system failure. It was a long shot, but his only shot. As he moved through the deserted bullpen, the hum returned, stronger now, vibrating not just in his bones, but seeming to emanate from the very walls. The static on his radio, even though it was off, continued to emit a faint, oppressive buzz. He felt a pressure building in his ears, like diving deep underwater. His path took him past the interrogation rooms. The doors were shut, but the one-way mirrors gleamed ominously in the flickering light. As he passed the second door, he heard it. A soft scratching sound coming from inside. He stopped dead, flashlight beam sweeping to the door. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding thin and reedy in the oppressive silence. "Is anyone in there?" The scratching paused. Then, it resumed, louder now, more insistent, like fingernails dragging across dry wood. Thorne knew the interrogation rooms were empty. They always were after hours. He slowly pushed open the heavy steel door. The room was dark, save for the faint glow filtering in from the hallway. He swept his flashlight across the table, the two chairs, and the reflective surface of the one-way mirror. Nothing. He moved further in, his boots squeaking softly on the polished linoleum. He directed the beam toward the mirror, checking for any cracks or damage. It was pristine. Then, he heard it again. The scratching. And it was coming from behind the mirror. Thorne frowned. There was a small observation room behind the mirror, where detectives watched interrogations. It was usually accessed from a separate hallway. It was impossible for anything to be inside the mirror itself. He pressed his ear against the cold glass. The scratching was faint now, almost like a mouse gnawing, but it was unmistakably there. And beneath it, a new sound began to emerge, a soft, rhythmic thump-thump-thump. It sounded like a heart. A very slow, very large heart. As Thorne listened, a single word, distorted by the static in his head, echoed in the periphery of his hearing. Closer, closer, closer. Suddenly, the image of his own reflection in the mirror began to distort. The glass seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. His features stretched, elongated, then compressed. And as his reflection warped, a faint, shadowy outline began to form behind his distorted image, a darker patch within the darkness of the observation room. It was tall, impossibly thin, and stood absolutely still. Thorne stumbled back, dropping his flashlight. It hit the floor with a clang and rolled under the table, its beam now pointing uselessly at the ceiling. The interrogation room plunged into deeper shadow. He fumbled for his sidearm, pulling it free. His eyes were wide, straining to pierce the gloom. The shadowy figure behind the mirror solidified further, becoming almost opaque. He could make out no features, just an absence of light, a void. Then, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump behind the mirror intensified, growing louder, resonating through the floor, making the very air vibrate. It was no longer a heart. It was something else. Something immense, and from the void in the mirror, a single, long, impossibly slender finger pressed against the glass from the other side. It left a faint, shimmering, glowing mark on the mirror's surface, like a trace of something bioluminescent. The voice in his head returned, clear now, no longer whispered, no longer distorted by static. It was the chilling contralto from the evidence room, colder than ice, devoid of emotion, yet filled with an ancient, predatory hunger. You are here. Thorne didn't wait. He didn't think. He fired 3 rounds into the one-way mirror, shattering the illusion, puncturing the glass with sharp, starburst patterns. Shards of safety glass exploded inward, leaving 3 ragged holes. Through the holes, he saw only darkness. No observation room. No shadowy figure. Just a void, deeper and blacker than anything he had ever seen. The thumping stopped. The hum subsided. The whispers vanished, only the static remained, a low, constant presence, like a whisper in the back of his mind that would never truly go away. He had destroyed the mirror, but he knew, with chilling certainty, that it hadn't destroyed it. It had only made it closer. Detective Thorne scrambled out of the interrogation room, the smell of gunpowder stinging his nostrils. He didn't look back at the shattered mirror, his focus narrowed to one objective: the chief's office and the manual lockdown override. The path to Chief Anderson's office was down a long, L-shaped corridor that passed the records archive and the break room. It was a route he had walked hundreds of times, a route that should take less than 30 seconds. As he turned the corner into the main administrative hall, he noticed the first impossibility: the hall was too long. It wasn't a dizzying optical illusion, it was a physical alteration of space. The distance between the corner he just turned and the fire exit sign, usually about 50 feet, now looked like 100. The lighting here was worse, the flickering bulbs casting deep, confusing pockets of shadow. The air tasted stale, like dust and forgotten secrets. Thorne pulled out his phone, holding up the camera screen to use the grid overlay as a rough measuring tool. He glanced from the screen to the real corridor. The geometry was wrong. It was mathematically impossible for this section of the building to be this long based on the municipal blueprints he'd just been reviewing. It's playing with the space, he realized, his mind racing. It's making the building bigger on the inside. He started moving again, quickly but cautiously. Every step was heavy, as if the floor were subtly sloped upwards. The unsettling hum returned, a pressure that felt like it was pushing against his eardrums from the inside. As he walked, he passed the doors to the various offices. He recognized the name plaques: Det. R. Mendez, SGT, J. Peterson, Officer M. Singh, but then, he passed a door that had no plaque. Just a smooth, pale wooden surface where a name should be. He stopped, shining his light on it. It wasn't an empty space, it was a redacted space that he reached out and touched the wood. It was inexplicably warm. A moment later, he passed the door to Officer Singh's cubicle again. Then Mendez's. Then the door with no plaque. That he was backtracking. But he hadn't turned around. Thorne froze. He pulled out the printout of the old amusement park map, Sarah Jenkins' map, that he'd taken from the evidence bin before the lockdown. He unfolded it and held it next to his official department diagram, trying to orient himself. The official station map showed a simple, straight hallway here. The Jenkins map, however, had an intricate, hand-drawn spiral pattern near the center, labeled simply, "The Way In." He looked up. The chief's office was now completely out of sight. The hallway stretched ahead into an endless, dark tunnel. He was caught in a non-Euclidean loop. Thorne realized that the layout of the police station, a building that symbolized order, logic, and structure, was being overwritten by the twisted, circular logic of the abandoned amusement park map found in the victim's car. He took a deep breath, fighting the surge of claustrophobic terror. He had to break the loop. He pressed his back against the wall of the hallway, feeling the plaster shudder faintly with the internal hum. He closed his eyes and tried to visualize the real station layout, ignoring what his eyes told him. As he did, a new sound cut through the static and the hum. A slow, grinding, heavy sound, like metal dragging against concrete. It was coming from the floor, about 20 feet ahead of him. He opened his eyes and swept the flashlight beam forward. The sound intensified. It was a file cabinet. A large, 4-drawer, industrial gray file cabinet had appeared in the middle of the hallway, blocking his path entirely. It wasn't just sitting there, it was being dragged across the floor toward him, slowly and relentlessly, without any visible hands or machinery. The metal bottom scraped loudly against the tile, leaving a dark, deep groove. On the front of the cabinet, scrawled in thick, wet, reddish-brown lettering that looked horribly like dried blood, was the single word, "Hush." The cabinet moved another foot. Closer. Thorne couldn't get around it. The hallway walls now felt closer, oppressive. He couldn't go back, he'd just loop back to the interrogation room. He raised his weapon again, aiming for the lock. If he could open the cabinet, maybe he could find a clue, or at least a distraction. But as his finger settled on the trigger, the top drawer of the cabinet slowly slid open on its own. Instead of files, the drawer was completely empty, save for one object resting perfectly in the center, the police photo of Sarah Jenkins, the missing librarian, smiling serenely, and resting on top of the photo was a small, desiccated human tongue, gray and dry, meticulously carved into the shape of a key. The cabinet stopped moving. The hum pulsed violently. Thorne stared at the horrific key. The message was clear: silence was the key to this case. Silence was the key to his escape, but as he looked at the tongue key, he noticed something in the blackness of the open drawer behind it. Something white. Something moving. It was the rock salt, the pristine white circle he had found beneath Sarah's house. Only this time, it was being meticulously poured from the drawer, dropping grain by grain onto the floor, forming a small, perfect crescent moon shape at the base of the cabinet. The door with the redacted nameplate pulsed with a faint, low red light. Thorne knew he had only a second before the entity was fully contained, or before the loop tightened around him forever. He ignored the cabinet, pivoted on his heel, and ran directly toward the pulsing, redacted door. He slammed his shoulder into the pale wood, praying it wasn't load-bearing. The wood gave way with a splintering crack, and Thorne tumbled through the opening and into the blackness beyond. He landed hard on concrete. When he looked up, the humming ceased, the static vanished, and the endless hallway was gone. He was standing, miraculously, in the small, unused janitorial closet located directly across from the chief's office. He had broken the loop, but the broken door behind him was still pulsing with that low, sickly red light. The thing had followed. Thorne scrambled out of the janitorial closet, pulling the splintered door shut behind him. The red pulse from the hallway beyond was dimmer now, but the wood still felt hot, sticky. The anomaly was temporarily contained, or perhaps, merely waiting. The chief's office was directly across the hall. It was a fortress of polished oak and sound-dampening glass. The door was a heavy, keycard-secured slab of mahogany. Thorne didn't bother with the card reader. He smashed the glass panel beside the frame with the butt of his pistol, reached through the jagged opening, and manually flipped the high-security deadbolt that he tumbled into the chief's expansive, darkened office. The space was eerily silent, devoid of the oppressive hum. The only light came from the chief's oversized, pristine mahogany desk. A single, large monitor was on, illuminating the room with a cold blue glow. Thorne ignored the desk, heading straight for the panel behind a framed photo of the chief shaking hands with the mayor. He wrenched the photo off the wall, revealing a small, industrial-looking metal box, the emergency lockdown override. He threw the toggle switch, the panel lights flared from red to green, accompanied by a resounding clunk that echoed through the station's silent structure. The automated voice, thankfully, did not return. Thorne checked his radio, still dead. The external communication was still jammed, but at least the emergency protocol should have unlocked the main exits. He turned back to the desk, his eyes catching the screen. It wasn't the usual email or budget spreadsheet. It was an open, heavily encrypted document, displaying a title in bold, all-caps lettering, Black Creek Protocol 001, Anomaly Siontianimianti. The document was dated January 1999. Thorne felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. This was older than his career, older than most of the furniture in the building. He leaned in, scanning the dense, clinical language. The summary explained that the anomalous presence in Black Creek was not an invader, but an indigenous spatial displacement, a psychic echo capable of bending local reality. It was initially contained within a specific geocoordinate, the abandoned amusement park, using an array of inert boundaries, the rock salt, and a single psychopomp artifact, the whistle. Thorne's blood ran cold. Sarah Jenkins was an atheist. She didn't put the salt down. She was holding the key. He scrolled down further, his finger trembling. The document revealed that for 30 years, the Black Creek Police Department, under the guise of maintaining town safety, had secretly been the custodian of the anomaly. The chief's role wasn't just policing, it was containment. The chilling realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Sarah Jenkins hadn't disappeared by chance. She was an unlisted keeper, maintaining the boundaries with the artifact. Her sudden absence 6 months ago didn't start the case, it was the failure of the protocol. The entity wasn't hunting a victim, it was returning to its home, and its home was the police station. Just as the last word of the document, containment is a zero-tolerance mandate, burned into his vision, the chief's phone on the desk, an old, landline model, began to ring. It wasn't a jarring sound, but a polite, insistent trill. Thorne stared at it. The station's comms were dead. There was no outside line. He knew he shouldn't answer, but the curiosity, the detective's instinct to know, overwhelmed his fear. He picked up the receiver. Chief Anderson's office, Thorne said, his voice flat. There was no static, no hum, no whispers. Just a clean, familiar connection. And then, a voice, warm, steady, paternal, the voice of Chief Anderson himself. "Elias," the voice said, calmly. "I see you found Protocol 001. I was hoping you wouldn't." Thorne swallowed, his mind reeling. "Chief, where are you?" The station is locked down. What is this? A sigh came over the line, a sound of profound disappointment. It's what we do, Elias. We keep the town quiet. Sarah was our latest asset. She failed. Now, I need you to place the whistle, artifact E14, back where you found it. You must secure the evidence locker. It is the only way to re-establish the boundary. You want me to lock myself in with it? Thorne demanded, his grip tightening on the receiver. You're already locked in with it, Elias, the chief replied, his tone shifting, becoming subtly flatter, colder. It has been feeding on the station structure and your presence for the last half hour. And now, it's sitting in my chair. Thorne looked up. The chief's massive, leather ergonomic chair, positioned facing the desk, was slowly swiveling toward him. The chair was empty. But as it came to rest, facing Thorne, the rich leather began to ripple, contorting inwards. The shape that emerged wasn't tall or shadowy. It was small, hunched, and wet, a creature formed from the silence and the psychic burden of the station itself. It looked at Thorne with Sarah Jenkins' wide, vacant eyes, and the voice from the phone, the familiar, comforting voice of the chief, suddenly emanated not from the receiver, but from the empty, dripping chair. The police are the containment, detective. Always have been. Always will be. Thorne dropped the phone. The receiver swung wildly on its cord, but the voice continued to drone out of the earpiece, an endless, monotonous loop of the chief's final instruction. Thorne raised his pistol, aiming at the terrible, waterlogged imitation of the woman he was supposed to save, the Redacted Files. He finally understood the title. The truth had been right in front of him. Thorne's breath hitched, the image of the wet, distorted figure sitting in the chief's chair, wearing Sarah Jenkins' vacant gaze, freezing him in place. He had faced down armed robbers and knife-wielding addicts, but this was different. This was a violation of reality itself, a terror born of secrecy and impossible physics. The figure in the chair didn't move. It simply sat, the leather of the chair absorbing the dripping water it seemed to be made of. The phone receiver swung, broadcasting the chief's final, damning words in an endless loop. The police are the containment, detective. Always have been. Always will be. Thorne raised his pistol, aiming for the center mass of the entity. But his finger hesitated on the trigger. He wasn't shooting an aggressor, he was shooting the physical manifestation of a protocol, a centuries-old cosmic error housed in the shell of an innocent woman. You're not the chief, Thorne growled, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hand. And you're not Sarah. The creature tilted its head, the motion slow and unnatural. Its lips, thin and bloodless, peeled back just enough to reveal teeth that were too long, too numerous, and disturbingly clean. We are the silence, Elias, the creature whispered, the voice a chorus of dry, rasping echoes that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his skull. And now, you are the final keeper. The entity launched itself from the chair, shedding the waterlogged leather that clung to its shape. It moved with the impossible speed of a striking viper, not running, but simply closing the distance. Thorne didn't hesitate this time. He squeezed the trigger, the gunshot deafened the office. The round hit the entity squarely in the chest. Instead of blood or flesh, the impact released a spray of salt and stagnant water. The figure staggered back, dissipating partially into a fine, white mist that smelled of brine and sulfur, leaving a sizzling, wet scorch mark on the carpet. It wasn't dead. It was repelled, the rock salt. Thorne remembered the evidence. The anomaly was contained by inert boundaries and psychopomp artifacts. Logic, cold and detached, returned to his mind, superseding panic. He wasn't fighting a man, he was fighting a fundamental law of the occult, the entity began to reform, slowly pulling the dissipated salt and water mist back toward its core. It was weaker now, its movements slower. Thorne glanced desperately around the chief's office. He needed salt. He needed the whistle. He needed to re-establish the boundaries. His eyes fell on the chief's private liquor cabinet. A crystal decanter sat on top. Thorne snatched it and smashed it against the edge of the desk. He jammed the ragged, heavy glass neck of the decanter into the entity's chest again. The creature didn't flinch. Instead, it raised a hand, a long, slender hand of dripping shadow, and pointed a finger toward the evidence room hallway. The protocol must be completed. Lock it away. Or we will take the town. The threat was what broke Thorne. He wasn't going to sacrifice himself for a secret conspiracy. The containment protocol was based on lies, and lies always break. He wouldn't be the final keeper. He backed away, never taking his eyes off the reforming figure. He needed to escape the station, not seal himself further inside its corrupted heart. He fled the chief's office, running back toward the janitorial closet, through the shattered doorway, and back into the looping, non-Euclidean hallway. The redacted door was now fully black, no longer red, a cold, smooth void. As he ran, he pulled off his heavy leather duty belt, discarding his flashlight, radio, and cuffs, anything that could weigh him down. He kept only his weapon, his phone, still recording the static, and the crucial piece of evidence from the start of the case, the map found in Sarah Jenkins' car. He unfolded the map, running with one hand, studying the hand-drawn spiral pattern labeled, "The Way In." He realized his mistake. He was following the building's logic. He needed to follow the map's logic. The spiral didn't lead in. It was a corkscrew. Thorne reached the section of the hall where the file cabinet had been dragged. The "hush" cabinet was gone, but the deep, gouged track in the floor remained. He followed the gouge, not the straight line of the wall. He moved off-axis, stepping across the center of the hallway. As he did, the geometry shifted again, violently. The walls seemed to rush inward, and the ceiling dropped. He felt dizzy, the nausea of spatial disorientation washing over him. He staggered, caught himself, and found he was no longer in the endless, straight corridor. He was standing on a metal fire escape landing, 3 flights up, looking down onto the deserted parking lot. He was outside the building's influence, at least partially. The external fire escape had always been locked down and monitored. Now, it was his escape route. He began to descend the rusting metal stairs. But just as he reached the second landing, he looked up and saw it. The lights of the top floor landing were blinking, not flickering, but blinking in a slow, deliberate pattern. It was Morse code. And it was spelling out a warning from the silence itself. Thorne ignored it. He was close. The ground was just one more flight down, but as he swung his leg onto the last flight of stairs, he stopped. The ground below wasn't the concrete of the parking lot. The stairs ended 20 feet up, suspended over a vast, pitch-black space. It wasn't night, it was the blackness of an open pit. The air rising from the void smelled of old carnival grease, wet earth, and salt. He looked down into the darkness, hearing a faint, familiar whistle rise from the abyss. He wasn't looking at the parking lot. He was looking at the bottom of the abandoned Black Creek amusement park. The entity had dragged the location of the containment area, the geo-coordinate, and placed it beneath the station. Thorne was trapped, suspended between the corrupted building and the endless void of the origin site. He was out of the police station, but he was exactly where the creature wanted him to be. Detective Thorne stood frozen on the unstable metal landing, the wind whipping around him, carrying the faint, sickly sweet scent of decay from the abyss below. The whistling sound, low and rhythmic, was clearly coming from the darkness where the parking lot should be. He was on a fire escape that now ended 20 feet in the air, a rusted bridge spanning the void of the amusement park's abandoned foundations that he tested the integrity of the railing. Rusted, but firm enough. The Morse code blinking from the window above, HIDE, was insistent. But hiding was what Sarah Jenkins had been forced to do, and it hadn't saved her. Thorne pulled his phone out of his pocket and angled the screen toward the void. The camera, still recording, didn't show solid ground or concrete. It showed a massive, gaping hole, and within it, the faint, geometric shapes of massive, decayed wooden supports and rusted steel tracks, the remnants of the park's deadliest ride, the Whisper-Will roller coaster. The entity was not just warping space, it was stacking locations. The police station was resting on top of the amusement park. Suddenly, the whole structure groaned. A loud, metallic screech echoed as the bottom portion of the fire escape stairs, the parts still connected to the ground, began to visibly bend inward, pulled by an unseen force emanating from the void. Thorne was losing his bridge to the world. He had to descend. He began to climb down the last few remaining steps, testing each joint carefully. The metal was cold and slick with dampness. The whistling grew louder, sharper, punctuated by a new sound, a hollow, rolling clatter, like a loose ball bearing dropping onto stone. He was about 10 feet from the bottommost visible step when he heard a noise that was definitively not paranormal. It was the sound of a cough. A real, human, phlegmy cough. Thorne stopped, gripping the railing. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice hoarse. The cough came again, closer this time, accompanied by the rustle of loose fabric and the clink of glass. A figure emerged from the shadows beneath the landing, right at the edge of the abyss. It wasn't the shadowy entity. It was an old man, bundled up in a filthy, oversized trench coat, his face obscured by a knitted cap and several days of white stubble. He was holding a large, clear glass jar filled with a murky brown liquid. "Don't move, copper," the man rasped, his eyes wide and panicked. "It'll feel you shift the balance. And it hates unbalanced things." "Who are you?" Thorne demanded, keeping his gun pointed toward the unknown man. "Name's Silas. I used to work the cleanup crew after the park shut down," Silas whispered, his gaze fixed nervously on the gaping hole beneath the stairs. "I know this hole. It's got an appetite. Why are you here?" "I'm keeping an eye on my boundaries," Silas said, nodding toward his jar. "Got a good stock of brine in here. Keeps the small things at bay." He shook the jar, and Thorne realized the murky liquid was saturated with heavy layers of rock salt. Silas was another keeper. An unofficial, unsung one. Sarah Jenkins. "Did you know her?" Thorne asked. Silas scoffed, a dry, bitter sound. "The librarian. Good heart, weak mind. They thought a piece of paper, a college degree, made her better than the rest of us. She was sloppy. Left the boundary open. Now you're here. The chief is a part of this. Protocol 001. He used Sarah," Thorne stated, watching the old man for any reaction. Silas merely nodded, unsurprised. "Yeah, the protocol. It always fails. You can't cage something that's the absence of space. You can only starve it." He pointed his brine jar toward the void. "That thing down there is the original silence of Black Creek. The why of this town." Suddenly, the whistling below stopped. The metal staircase beneath Thorne's feet began to vibrate violently. "It hears us talking," Silas yelled, his voice cracking. "The information is food. Don't let it in. You have the whistle, don't you? The artifact?" "It's back in the station," Thorne admitted. Silas's face fell into an expression of utter defeat. "Idiot. The artifact is the only thing it cares about. It wants it home. With a sickening shing sound, the last few structural bolts holding the fire escape to the wall sheared off. The entire staircase buckled and swung outward, dangling precariously over the black pit, held only by the topmost connections. Thorne clung desperately to the railing as the stairs plunged down. He was now dangling directly above Silas. "Help me!" Thorne yelled. Silas looked up, his eyes meeting Thorne's. For a moment, a flicker of humanity returned to the old man's face, but then, the whistling returned, this time right next to Silas's ear. Silas's eyes went wide with paralyzing fear. He dropped the brine jar, the jar hit the edge of the pit and shattered. The salt brine exploded into a cloud of white mist that was immediately sucked down into the darkness. "No, no, no," Silas whimpered, backing away from the edge. As the salt was absorbed, a new form began to rise from the void where the brine had fallen. It was a shifting, columnar shape, like a vortex of swirling dark vapor, illuminated faintly by the emergency lights of the still-locked police station above. The vortex stopped directly in front of Silas, and a single, elongated hand reached out from the swirling vapor. The hand was not shadowy, it was comprised entirely of hundreds of tiny, brittle, dried-out leaves, the debris of years past. Now animated, the hand of leaves gently touched Silas's chest. Silas did not scream. He did not fight. He simply deflated. His body collapsed instantly inward, the heavy trench coat and clothing falling in an empty, wrinkled heap onto the concrete. The old man was gone, instantly and completely, leaving behind only his clothes and a faint puff of gray, salty dust. The entity, having consumed the old man and his knowledge, turned its attention to Thorne, who was still dangling on the ruined fire escape. The whistling stopped, replaced by the chilling, synthesized voice of the security alert he'd heard earlier. Containment breach resolution, new keeper acquired. Thorne was alone, facing the void, clinging to a broken structure. He was the next keeper. Thorne clung to the rotting handrail, limbs trembling. The fire escape had snapped loose and now hung suspended, swaying dangerously over a black abyss. Below, where the parking lot should have been, there was only a deep pit choked with the stench of damp rot, old oil, and salt. The entity's synthesized, icy voice rose from the void, carrying the cruelty of a verdict. Limit zone breach resolved, new keeper has assumed control. Silas was gone, reduced to a hollow heap of clothing. The entity had taken his knowledge, and now it was stronger, faster, and entirely focused on Thorne. "Not a chance," Thorne snarled, tightening his grip on the gun. The entity was no longer a swirling vapor. It began to assemble itself from what the environment offered: dust, rust, and ruined metal along the staircase. It formed into a jagged, grotesque object, an old metal sign, bent and bullet-pocked, still faintly bearing the reversed letters, "Welcome to Black Creek." The sign hovered in front of Thorne. He knew he couldn't climb back up. He couldn't stay here either. The staircase was being dragged downward. He glanced at Sarah Jenkins' map. The hand-drawn lines marked a spiral route curling around the amusement park grounds. The way in. If the way in is a spiral, Thorne muttered, then the way out has to be the inversion. He made a reckless decision. He aimed his pistol at the last bolts holding the upper section of the fire escape to the wall and fired twice. Bang! Bang! The shots cracked through the void. The final bolts sheared free. The entire staircase gave way. Thorne let go of the rail. He fell, not into bottomless emptiness, but into a jagged collapse of debris. Crash! He slammed down hard on an uneven surface, wedged between rotted beams and rusted metal. Blood leaked from a cut along his arm. He dropped onto the park's foundation, directly over the original anomalous coordinates. The entity, still wearing the shape of the sign, drifted down lightly, only a few steps away. Wrong choice, new keeper. Down here, we are the strength. Your limits are broken. Thorne coughed, forcing himself up. He looked at the ground beneath his boots. It was covered in a thick layer of white dust. Salt. This was the inert boundary layer that Silas and the other keepers had used to seal this place for 30 years. Thorne kicked hard, scattering the salt into the air. The crystals broke apart and dissolved into the damp darkness. He looked back at the map. The fallen flashlight cast a weak glow over the page, and Thorne finally saw it for what it was. The lines weren't ordinary ink. They were ridges of dried, hardened salt. The map isn't a guide, Thorne gritted out. It's a formula. The sign thing taunted him. Pointless. Without the artifact, the whistle, you are just a vessel. The artifact draws consciousness. It is the anchor. And it is inside the station. Thorne understood. The whistle wasn't just a relic, it was the anchor that bound a keeper's mind here, chaining them to maintain the boundary. Sarah Jenkins had taken the whistle, been forced to return, and was eventually consumed. He still had the spiral. Instead of following it, Thorne began to move against it. He walked the inverse path, using his boots and hands to carve counterlines through the salt on the ground, tracing a mirrored spiral against the one on the map. Not going in, Thorne murmured. Breaking out of the formula. The entity shrieked, the metal sign twisted violently. You're destabilizing it. Stop. To stop him, it acted. A massive rusted steel arm, the support limb of the Whisper-Will coaster, lurched up from the rubble and swung straight at him. Thorne dove aside just in time. The steel arm smashed into the ground, sending rust and salt exploding outward. He kept going, dragging and scarring the salt trails, walking the spiral in reverse. The further he moved against the pattern, the more the space seemed to harden and clarify. It felt like wading out of a vat of tar. At last, he reached an area where the salt layer thinned. Instantly, everything shifted. The abyss vanished. He was standing on solid ground. He looked up. Above him was just a wet brick wall of the police station. No suspended staircase. No yawning chasm. The void had been pushed back. Thorne had forced the anomalous coordinates out of the physical footprint of the parking lot. He was out of the station. But not out of Black Creek. He stood in the narrow space behind the building, utterly alone. Overhead, the station's emergency floodlights snapped on. Not flickering encoded pulses, just a hard, blinding, physical light carving through the night. Thorne stared into it. On the slick brick surface, he saw a shadow move, a small, dry silhouette, no longer human-shaped and no longer a sign. A compact, pitch-black object, crusted with salt and rust, retreating slowly into the darkness just beyond the beam. He knew it was still here. Waiting. Thorne finally managed to power on his phone. No cell signal, but the camera still worked. He unlocked the screen. Right then, a notification popped up. A text message draft, created 6 months ago but never sent. From Sarah Jenkins' number. It contained only 3 words. I saw it. And attached to it, a file. Detective Thorne stood in the deserted parking lot, leaning against the cold brick wall of the police station. The emergency floodlights blazed, casting his long shadow across the pavement. The silence outside was a fragile thing, constantly threatening to break under the pressure of the lingering hum he could still feel in his teeth. He stared at the ghost text on his phone screen, Sarah Jenkins' unsent message. I have seen. And the attached file, the phone, though unable to connect to a network, still functioned internally. Thorne tapped the attachment icon. It was a single image file, labeled simply 734_core.jpg. The image loaded slowly, pixel by agonizing pixel. It wasn't a selfie, or a photo of the salt boundary, or even a picture of the whistle.it was a photograph of a police badge. Specifically, it was a close-up, high-resolution shot of a standard Black Creek Police Department badge, silver and star-shaped, resting on a white, sterile surface, likely the evidence bench, but what Sarah had focused on was the center. The badge had the town seal engraved there, a simple image of a creek, bordered by 2 pine trees. Sarah Jenkins had meticulously, and unervingly, circled a small, almost invisible detail on the badge's engraving with a faint red marker. It wasn't the creek, or the trees.it was the gap between the 2 pine trees, where the water met the land.in the original, standard police badge. The seal showed 3 minuscule, interlocking swirls in that spot, signifying the confluence of the Black Creek and its 2 tributaries, but in the photo Sarah sent, one of the swirls was missing. It had been subtly filed down or erased, leaving only 2 perfect interlocking swirls. And below the 2 remaining swirls, Sarah had scribbled 2 lines of almost illegible text, 2 keepers. 2 swirls. Where is the third? And, it is the silence. It is the seal. Thorne felt the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle click into place. The protocol wasn't about locking the entity away, it was about feeding it. The keepers, Sarah, Silas, and presumably the third, now missing person, and their constant vigilance, their knowledge, and ultimately their lives, were the containment. The police badge was the central artifact, the literal seal of the town's secret. The 3 swirls represented the 3 keepers required to maintain the stasis. Sarah had been the third. When she failed, the protocol fractured, but the question remained, why had Sarah seen the alteration on the badge? And why was the badge altered in the first place? Thorne thought back to the chief's office, and the wet, shadowy creature sitting in the leather chair, speaking with the chief's voice. The police are the containment. Thorne ran his hand over the badge on his own uniform shirt. He unpinned it, his fingers tracing the engraved metal. His badge had all 3 interlocking swirls. It was the standard issue. He looked back at Sarah's photo. The filing was too precise, too deliberate to be accidental. Where the missing swirl isn't a mistake. It's a signature, someone inside the police department, someone with access to the engraving tools and the badge supply, someone who understood the real protocol, had deliberately marked a badge to signal a breach, or perhaps, to signal their own survival, and that marked badge was the third swirl, the missing keeper, the one who had survived by not maintaining the boundary. Thorne glanced at the front of the station. He had to get back inside. Not for the whistle, but for the file cabinet he'd smashed through in the chief's office, the personnel files. He needed to find out who was missing, who had the unique, 2-swirl badge. He turned toward the front entrance, about to make his move, when a sudden, new sound pierced the night. It wasn't the hum, or the static, or the whistling. It was the clean, unmistakable sound of a car engine starting up in the parking lot. Thorne dropped low behind a patrol car. The engine revved, and a dark, unmarked sedan, a police fleet vehicle, pulled into the glare of the floodlights, and behind the wheel was Officer Maya Singh, his partner. She stopped the car, then slowly stepped out. She looked tired, her uniform immaculate, her expression unreadable. She walked slowly toward the back of the building, toward Thorne's position, as if she knew exactly where he was. "Elias," she called out, her voice calm and level, cutting through the silence of the night. Chief Anderson radioed. "He said you had a Code Black event. The lockdown is over. I'm here to take the evidence." Thorne held his breath, his eyes fixed on her. He didn't trust it. The chief's radio was dead when he tried it. The lockdown override had been manual. He focused his flashlight on her chest, specifically on her badge. It was exactly the same as the badge in Sarah's photo. Silver, star-shaped, and in the center of the seal, only 2 interlocking swirls remained. The third had been neatly, perfectly filed away. Maya Singh wasn't the third keeper. She was the one who broke the containment, the survivor of the protocol, the one who saw the logic and made a choice. She had been waiting for the anomaly to consume the others, ensuring her own silence. Thorne realized with a sickening jolt that she hadn't been skeptical of the woo-woo, because she was rational. She was skeptical because she knew exactly what the woo-woo was capable of. Maya, Thorne said, stepping out from behind the patrol car, his gun lowered but visible. Did you take the third swirl? Singh stopped, her expression hardening. She didn't reach for her sidearm. She merely pointed a calm finger toward the evidence room entrance. The whistle is calling for a host, Elias. You have 30 seconds to comply with Protocol 001. Put the artifact back, and I'll make sure your retirement papers are processed cleanly. You saw the truth. You can choose the silence. Thorne looked from her 2-swirl badge to the wall behind him, where the void of the amusement park had briefly manifested. He knew the entity was still close, circling them both, waiting for one of them to fail. The containment is the lie, Maya, Thorne stated, folding Sarah's map and putting it away. The whistle is the lure. The truth is what we have to find. Thorne raised his pistol, not at his partner, but toward the nearest emergency light. He fired. Crash, the floodlight exploded, plunging the parking lot into sudden, confusing darkness. He had shattered the illusion of order. The hum returned, instantly and violently. The game had just changed. The sudden explosion of the floodlight plunged the parking lot into deep shadow, momentarily disorienting Officer Maya Singh. Thorne capitalized on the chaos, sprinting toward the perimeter fence, not to escape, but to create distance and gain cover. The move was based on the logic of the anomaly itself: disruption equals repulsion. The entity thrived on order, structure, and the silence of a well-maintained lie. By shattering the light and the silence, Thorne bought himself time. Elias. You're breaking the first rule. Singh's voice was sharp, cutting through the heavy air. She was furious, her voice laced with the cold authority of someone who believed they held the true power. The silence keeps it contained. The silence feeds it, Maya. Thorne countered, ducking behind a large dumpster. He could see her form, a dark silhouette against the glow of the remaining station lights, moving methodically, weapon now drawn. She was a trained officer, and this was now a tactical engagement, albeit one layered with supernatural horror. Thorne pulled out the heavy roll of duct tape he'd stripped from his discarded duty belt. He needed to establish a boundary, but he had no rock salt. He had only the knowledge he'd gleaned from the protocol. He taped Sarah's map, the one with the drawn spiral, to the side of the dumpster. He didn't tape it to keep it safe, he taped it to anchor it. You should have left the station when you had the chance, Singh said, her voice now dangerously close. The chief made his choice. I made mine. Now you'll make yours. Your choice was to let the town be consumed, Maya, Thorne retorted. You filed down your badge. The 2 swirls. You became a witness, not a keeper. You're letting the silence win. The silence is survival. Singh yelled, firing a shot toward the dumpster. The bullet ricocheted harmlessly off the thick metal. It doesn't care about the town. It cares about the artifact and the protocol. Give me the location of the whistle. Thorne ignored her. He was tracing the spiral on the map with his finger. The way in. He realized the true significance of the map wasn't the salt lines, but the points of entry. The spiral had 3 crucial points marked with small, faint X's. He recognized them now: Sarah's house, the amusement park, and the police station's evidence locker. He needed a new entry point, a new way to disrupt the protocol. He grabbed the duct tape again, and began to run the tape in a thick, sticky line across the cracked asphalt of the parking lot, creating a jagged, non-straight line. It was an improvised inert boundary, a chaotic line meant to confuse the entity's spatial warping. Singh saw his movement and fired again. The bullet grazed Thorne's shoulder, a searing pain reminding him that this was real. Thorne ducked and completed his tape line. He stepped across the barrier he'd just created, immediately feeling a subtle shift. The oppressive hum lessened, and the ground beneath his feet felt solid again. The tape, a simple, non-organic boundary, worked. "You can't keep building walls, Elias," Singh screamed, rushing his position. "The entity is inside you now. It knows your thoughts. Then let it hear this." Thorne shouted back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the desiccated human tongue carved into the shape of a key, the horrific artifact he'd found in the hush cabinet. He had pocketed it without thinking. It was an object of extreme silence and horror. Thorne took the tongue key and, with a grim determination that chilled even his own blood, he threw it over the fence, directly into the path of Singh's advancing form. The moment the tongue key crossed the tape boundary, the air ruptured, the hum immediately spiked to an intolerable pitch. The black, shadowy mass, the lingering physical essence of the entity, flashed into view directly behind Maya Singh, coalescing from the shadows of the police cars. It was attracted to the artifact of silence. Singh saw the flash of movement and whirled around, momentarily forgetting Thorne. She aimed her gun at the rising shadow. "Get back," she commanded, her training kicking in. The entity didn't retreat. It didn't rush. It simply spoke, using the amplified, layered voice of all the keepers it had consumed. "The lack of silence is a sin." As the voice hammered at Singh, Thorne seized his chance. He aimed his own pistol and fired not at her, but at the two-swirl badge on her chest. He needed to destroy the symbol of her silence, the physical manifestation of her survival protocol. The shot was clean. The bullet impacted the metal badge with a sharp, sickening clink. Singh gasped, clutching her chest. She didn't fall, but her stance wavered. The badge was gone, ripped away by the force of the shot, but the effect was immediate and unexpected. The black, shadowy mass behind her, which had been focusing its attention on the tongue key, suddenly shrieked, a sound of pure, raw distortion. It recoiled violently from Singh, as if she had suddenly become poisonous to it. Thorne realized his error and his success simultaneously. The two-swirl badge wasn't a symbol of survival, it was a tether. It was the entity's own mark, a small, controlled access point to its willing host. By destroying the badge, Thorne hadn't saved her, he had unleashed her. Maya Singh stood up straight, her hands dropping to her sides. Her eyes, normally sharp and intelligent, were now completely black, reflecting the remaining floodlights like polished obsidian. The dark mass of the entity hesitated, looking from the discarded tongue to the now unfettered Singh, and then, Maya Singh began to whistle. It wasn't the slow, rhythmic call of the wooden artifact. It was a high, piercing, discordant sound, a note of ownership and control. She wasn't just whistling, she was singing the entity's song. She was no longer the keeper. She was the new artifact. "Elias," she said, her voice now a horrifying blend of her own tone and the chilling contralto from the evidence room. "The silence is mine now. And you, detective, are the distraction." She didn't move. But the shadows around her elongated, stretching into impossible, reaching shapes that swirled and coalesced, obeying the piercing note of her whistled song. The parking lot was a battlefield of shadows and warped reality. Maya Singh, now the unwilling host for the entity's consciousness, stood motionless, emitting a high, piercing whistle that seemed to vibrate the very ground. The surrounding shadows writhed, obeying the note of control. Thorne was trapped behind his improvised duct tape boundary, the whistling note cutting into his mind like glass. He gripped his pistol, but realized shooting Maya was useless. He wasn't fighting his partner, he was fighting the concept of silence and containment that possessed her. The entity's shadowy extensions, responding to Singh's song, began to peel the asphalt off the ground, lifting sheets of pavement like paper and tossing them aside. The creature was hunting the artifact, the whistle, which was still inside the station. And it was using Maya to clear the path. Thorne focused on the last message from Sarah Jenkins: 2 keepers. 2 swirls. Where is the third? And, it is the silence. It is the seal. The third swirl wasn't a person. It was a location. A point of containment that had been filed away and forgotten. Thorne thought back to the core elements of the station: the evidence locker, the lure, the chief's office, the protocol, the interrogation room, the witness, the admin hallway, the spatial distortion. Where was the one place in the station that symbolized absolute, mandated silence, a place of total isolation that the keepers would have used to maintain their vigilance? The holding cells. The cells were deep in the basement, designed to silence and contain the worst of the town's criminals. It was the only place that hadn't been physically warped or violated yet. It was the true seal. Thorne sprinted along the tape boundary, staying on the stable side. He had to get back inside the station, past Singh, and down to the basement. You can't escape the pattern, Elias. Singh's amplified voice boomed. Her head snapped toward him, and she raised her hands. The shadowy tendrils obeyed, coalescing into a sharp, spear-like projection aimed directly at Thorne. Thorne dodged the incoming projectile, which slammed into the duct tape line and instantly melted the tape into black, steaming goo. The temporary boundary was gone. He ran for the nearest entry point, a side window of the break room. He smashed through it, ignoring the spray of glass, and tumbled back into the dark interior of the station. Singh followed instantly. Before he could stand, he heard her land lightly on the floor behind him. The whistling note was now deafening. "You're making this easy," she stated, the voice devoid of warmth. Thorne grabbed a handful of stale coffee grounds from the overturned trash can, the only dark, granular material he could find, and threw them straight into Singh's face. The entity shrieked in outrage. The coffee grounds, a simple, non-salt, non-metal foreign object, disrupted its focus. The shadows around Singh wavered. Thorne used the precious second of distraction to sprint for the stairs leading to the basement. He raced down the concrete steps. The air in the basement was thick and musty, smelling strongly of cleanser and disinfectant. He arrived at the holding cell corridor. The lights here were sparse, but functional. The cells were empty. The silence here was different. It was a heavy, enforced silence. Thorne ran to the last cell, cell block D. The cell door was a thick, barred slab of steel. On the wall opposite the door, he saw it wasn't a filing or an engraving. It was an old, faded bloodstain on the concrete, right where a prisoner would lean their head against the wall. Sarah's photo had shown a filed-down swirl. The filed swirl meant redacted. Thorne looked closer at the bloodstain. It was old and mostly faded, but a faint, circular outline remained. The outline looked disturbingly like the original town seal. And within that outline, someone, a former prisoner, another keeper, or maybe the first victim, had used their own blood to draw the missing third swirl. The third swirl was a mark of sacrifice and containment. He pulled his phone back out, opening the recording app. The recording of the constant static, the entity's presence, was still running. Thorne pressed the phone against the faint, blood-drawn swirl on the wall, hitting the stop button on the recording. He wasn't trying to capture the sound, he was trying to deposit it. He was using the digital recording of the anomaly's signature static as the new keeper, transferring the evidence of the entity's presence, its voice, into the original point of containment. The moment the recording stopped and the phone touched the blood swirl, the basement shook violently. Screch, a sound of tearing metal erupted from upstairs. The whistling from Maya Singh stopped instantly. Thorne heard a muffled crash, followed by the terrifying sound of the chief's office chair, the one the entity had sat in, rolling rapidly down the concrete stairs. It wasn't a chair anymore. It was a spinning mass of sharp metal and shadow, but as the chair rushed toward the holding cells, it hit an invisible barrier and stopped dead. The blood-drawn swirl pulsed. The phone on the wall vibrated intensely, the last fragment of the entity's static being violently pulled into the concrete. The shadowy mass of the entity hesitated, looking from the phone, the new, digital keeper, to Thorne. "You have sealed U.S." The voice roared, no longer through Singh, but through the vibrating concrete itself. The entity's presence was being sucked into the wall. The shadow, the chair, the whistling, it was all retreating, pulled toward the final, hidden seal. Thorne grabbed the steel bars of the holding cell door. He looked into the dark, receding presence, and delivered his final message. "No, I haven't sealed you away. I've sealed the evidence of you." With a final, agonizing crunch of metal, the entire basement went dark. The entity was gone. The hum ceased. The only sound left was the ragged, human breathing of a woman who had just been freed. Thorne rushed back upstairs. Maya Singh was lying near the break room window, unconscious, clutching a bloody wound on her chest where the badge had been. She was breathing. The blackness had retreated from her eyes. He looked back toward the evidence room. The steel door was slightly ajar. The silence that followed the crunch was absolute. Not the oppressive, suffocating silence of the entity, but the natural, empty silence of a night that had finally exhausted itself. Detective Thorne pulled himself up the basement stairs. His shoulder throbbed from Singh's bullet, and his head spun from the spatial distortion, but he was alive. He found Officer Maya Singh where he'd left her. She was conscious, coughing weakly, curled in a fetal position with her hands instinctively covering the raw, bloody hole in her uniform where the badge had been. The blackness was gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep, hollow trauma. "Elias," she whispered, her voice a dry rattle. "What did you do?" "I made a choice," Thorne said simply, kneeling beside her. "I made the silence permanent." He checked her vitals. Stable. He would call for help, but first, he had to check the core of the infection. He walked to the evidence room door. The steel slab was now slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The room was bathed in the cold, pale light of the pre-dawn. The air was frigid, and the scent of ozone was overwhelming. The evidence bin for case 734 was still on shelf 4B. The lid was open. Thorne approached slowly, gun drawn. The bin was empty. Sarah Jenkins' files, her belongings, the photos, the salt, and the map, all gone. All evidence of the containment, and the victim, had been scrubbed. The entity, retreating into the seal, had taken its truth with it. Only one item remained, resting in the center of the foam liner, exactly where the whistle had lain, was a single, heavy police-issued keyring. Attached to it was the key to the main station entrance. The whistle was gone. It had returned to its origin, or perhaps, it had been the final sacrifice, the true core of the entity's retreat. Thorne picked up the keyring. It was cold, clean, and real. He was back in a world of normal keys and locked doors. He radioed dispatch. The static was gone. The line was clear. "This is Detective Thorne. Black Creek Station. We have an officer down, Officer Singh. Gunshot wound to the torso. Request EMS and backup. We've had a structural incident. He deliberately omitted the details of the protocol, the entity, and the warped reality. He had witnessed the ultimate truth of the redacted files: the truth is the fuel. The silence survives by having its evidence destroyed. By 8 a.m., the station was swarming with external investigators, EMS, and Chief Anderson, who arrived looking pale, shaken, and utterly bewildered. Thorne. What in God's name happened here? The chief demanded, staring at the shattered interrogation room mirror. Thorne gave his statement: an armed intruder, the lockdown, a shootout in the evidence room, and a brief, tactical retreat to the fire escape before the intruder was neutralized. He claimed Singh was injured during the exchange, and the structural damage was caused by the intruder's heavy weaponry. He didn't mention the hum, the tongue key, the two-swirl badge, or the blood on the basement wall. Singh's account, given under heavy sedation, was a confused, rambling mess of shadows, whispers, and orders to maintain the silence. Her story was dismissed as trauma-induced delirium. The case was officially closed. Sarah Jenkins remained a missing person, filed as presumed deceased. The intruder was listed as an unapprehended perpetrator with no physical description. A week later, Thorne was back at his desk, his arm in a sling. He was cleared of all wrongdoing. Chief Anderson, visibly aging a decade in a week, quietly retired, citing health issues. As Thorne was clearing his desk, he found one final item tucked into the drawer. It was an old, heavy paperweight from the chief's office, a simple glass sphere. He picked it up. Inside the glass, suspended in the center, was a tiny, intricately carved wooden whistle. It was identical to artifact E14, but impossibly sealed in glass. Beneath the paperweight was a small, handwritten note, unsigned: "The silence always seeks a host. The keepers are retired, detective. But the witness remains. Never break the silence again, or the evidence will return to you." Thorne played